Do we have any questions from the audience? Here we go.
What I'm curious about is from those of you who have worked in state and local government, I know we're not supposed to say that anymore, is there a place that officials from each jurisdiction can turn to find best practices? I think all of you have mentioned this idea that people are out there on their own trying to invent their records practices and things like it. And I'm curious, is there a place that would be a natural home to be someplace for best practices and for advice?
Well, I could say in Maine, similar to what is in New York, is there's a state law that requires every local official to take training in open records law. So either our attorney walks us through in my little town, or there's a municipal association of towns that does that kind of training. So that's required by law. I've got other things I could say, but I'll wait for. You've said it, I suppose.
Well, again, I'm an advocate for a neutral advisory body that gives legal advice not only to government employees and officials, but the public at large. Did I say I come from a small office? Yeah. Yeah.
I guess this is, I'm answering a question with a question. I'm wondering if there are organizations like the National League of Cities or the Institute of Local Government, I think in California, does other kinds of training. Are there these sort of organizations of public officials that might provide best practices sharing?
One of the places that we travel to the most on our educational circuits are to the Association of Mayors, the Association of Town Clerks, the County Attorney Association. We do lots of our training through these kind of professional associations of municipal officials. Our next largest group of people who request training are from organizations like Leagues of Women Voters in a community, or a library association who'll put on an event for the public. We always require that the door be open to everyone. But those are valuable associations in a community, I think.
Aloha, Sean McLaughlin with Knight Media Policy Fellow with New America Foundation. Thank you so much for the discussion. Some of us out in the hinterlands, out in Eureka, California, for example, are working on pulling this together at a community level and coming up with solutions like you mentioned, Peter, at the end there, the need to create a sort of unified archiving instrument. And we're working with the Internet Archive, archive.org, and we've created a tool set that automatically takes your gavel-to-gavel coverage of your local government meeting and posts it to Internet Archive, and we leave the archiving to them, given that for small jurisdictions it really is very difficult to support all of that infrastructure. I just wonder if you're familiar with Internet Archive, if you think this is the kind of concept that would meet that goal of sort of creating some infrastructure behind so that a lot of small jurisdictions could use this tool. It's automated. You televise your meeting, you upload it once, now it's archived forever. As long as you get your metadata correct, you don't need to hire somebody like Granicus. I mean, there's a lot of private companies in the gap between there, but you really can do it yourself, and that's what we're trying to do out in our part of the country.
I don't know about that particular initiative, but that's exactly the kind of thing I had in mind. That there are so many. I spent 9 years of my adult life in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is in Allegheny County, which has something in excess of 180 municipalities. And they absolutely cannot afford to maintain a kind of constant interactive web presence on a municipality by municipality basis. But if there were some way of sharing the resource, it would become wonderfully affordable, and it would have the great advantage of not changing from administration to administration. I mean, one of the things that does drive me crazy actually at the federal level, and I think it's even worse with states and localities, is that the entire web presence of the government changes every time there's a new administration. Documents disappear. One of the last things I did in the Bush administration was try to download everything off the White House website that I thought I would need for my research, because I knew it would disappear on January 21st. And so, if you maintain the historical continuity, that's a great service.
Well, and maybe a quick follow-up on that is if it's not a change of administration. If you've sort of contracted that out to a vendor, what happens when your contract ends then? If you've got somebody, I mean, I'm sorry to use one particular company as example, but if you've contracted that service, what happens at the end of your contract? Mm-hmm. Which is why we're looking for open source tools, and the best thing we found so far is archive.org. I'm curious if there's a better place, but thank you.
Could I make a comment about that? And that is, I worry, being an archivist, okay, I put that old hat on, I worry about outsourcing my archives, even to archives.org or whatever. I mean, that's been a great project, I'm familiar with it, but what if they decide they just don't want to play that game anymore? What if they want to change their formats for something else? Or do we just not think that, I'm just exaggerating here a little bit, that the video of the local meeting isn't that important, so what the heck? So I really, I think it's very important to make the archival records of government within the control of some public body, let's put it that way, presumably the government. And you gave the perfect example of contracting out for this, but I really would not encourage that unless it's a consortium of a reliable institution that plans to be around for hundreds of years, because that's what we're talking about in archives terms, hundreds and hundreds of years. And that will take the commitment to ensure that those records, you know, are accessible in whatever crazy way we access them in longer term. I just want to quickly say I was feeling pretty puffy about some of the things my little town does, but I've got educated here in the last few minutes. We do have the videos of our meetings online, and people can look at them on our little community station, or they can watch it live. Our agendas and minutes and calendar is online, and people can capture the video and play it back, you know, so boy, are we great, until you got to posting all the documents of the meeting online in advance of the meeting. You know, that makes perfect sense, and I'm going to recommend that, then we will be perfect, I guess.
Thanks for having this forum. As a citizen, I have a couple questions. If the government's going to go with, like, perhaps a third-party partner to help digitize their documents, like you said, how do you guarantee that that partner is going to stick around and they're going to stay, you know, consistent and be able to deliver the documents to the public in a way that it isn't politically influenced? If they're a private company, how are we not to know that their shareholders aren't influencing the way the documents are presented to the public? Second of all, open source is wonderful. It's a great fantasy. Who's going to pay for it? How can citizens convince Congress that this is important, that they need to give money to the agencies to do this? I mean, these are great ideas, but it's outrageously expensive. And who in this current economic situation is going to be able to put enough influence on Congress to let them know that this is extremely important for every federal agency as well as the states?
Well, perhaps we phase it in, starting with language in the law that says when it's reasonable to do so, and then over time, as the demand creates products that are less expensive, we then make it a requirement. I don't know exactly the answer to that question, but did I tell my story about losing my support staff? Okay. We're an office of 2. I told you this before, right? We're tiny in New York State. Up until December of last year, we were an office of 3. We lost our one administrative support person, and for the foreseeable future, she will not be replaced. So it's now become my job to make sure that the advisory opinions that we write get posted to our website. I don't know how to do that, but Sheila down the hall does. She works for a different office. So I asked Sheila down the hall, would you do this? And she says, oh, sure, I used to do that for your support person. But what she doesn't tell me is that what the support person used to do included morphing that advisory opinion into something that could actually be posted online. So Sheila came back a week later and she said, you know, you'd save me a week's worth of work on, like, 50 documents if you could just start it in this format with this template that I have at my desk rather than starting it in your Microsoft Word document. Great. Now we start our documents in that format. Not only does it save Sheila the work, but it saves me the heartache of knowing, you know, am I going to have to deal with 50 more documents when I get back to the office that weren't, you know, the underlining didn't go through on the website or whatever it is that happened. It's an extremely simple example, but if I can save both the administrative support person and Sheila down the hall those 5 steps, we got to do it. We got to do it. That's the investment in that's investing in the technology and driving the demand again.
Peter, quick comment. We're running a
quickly,
little over. We've got one more question to take.
Right. So I just want to say that, you know, the question also brings up again, I think, the importance of media institutions of whatever form in this environment, because I do think that there is a link between the decline, and this is no apology for the behavior of, you know, how good or bad newspapers have been traditionally, but if you look at the decline in state house reporting, just the sheer numbers of people assigned to state houses, and the phenomenon of states cutting back on open government laws, I mean, it's not an accidental correlation. If we want to have governments responsive, including in terms of resources, there has to be a way of amplifying the voice of individual citizens. If it's going to be more citizen journalists, then those citizen journalists need to be trained in their rights. There have to be ways for them to be able to organize together to amplify their collective voice, because otherwise there's just not going to be the kind of resource pressure that there needs to be to make the law other than an unfunded and unobserved mandate.
Mm-hmm. One last question?
Sure. I was going to show up here for a question. I had just 2 quick responses. One, there is a way to amplify citizens' voices. It's the internet. I mean, show up on Twitter or Facebook or to any public site, and we can hear each other's voices more clearly than ever before. When we saw that happen in the Middle East, we're seeing that happen here. The question is how and where government can identify us online. That seems like one of the stickiest sources. Government needs to figure that out, but they need industry to figure it out for them. I understand that the White House's NSTIC program next week may help with that. To the extent that open source is a fantasy, well, no one ever said it was free. It takes time and resources to maintain it. But whitehouse.gov, fcc.gov, various parts of NASA, and all parts of government are using open source. It's in no way a fantasy. It just simply means that you have to think about resources in a different way. And to the extent of municipalities not being able to maintain websites, WordPress is free. To host a website costs you $50 a year. To maintain to register a website URL is $10. I would represent that is probably something that local towns can do if they choose to do it. The question is whether they're aware that those tools exist, whether they're aware that there's an open government community online which is very interested in helping them, something that's happening out in Bell, California, actually. I think the question I had is really around this issue of the future of long-form journalism and the people that it's meant to serve. You know, the economic models are something that has been debated again and again and again at journalism conferences, so we probably won't revisit that here. But to what extent can citizens play a role in the kinds of work that you're describing? Because there is some kind of connection between the collective action that the internet acts as a platform for them to engage in. How and where should NGOs, legal institutions, and so-called traditional media be working with citizens as opposed to thinking of them as just the audience?
I can talk about that a little bit because we actually do work with citizens quite a bit. We have a ProPublica news network of folks who have decided that in some cases they want to help us gather information. So it came very handy early days stimulus coverage when there was no recovery.gov and we needed folks at local levels to take pictures of projects, to get documents about projects. To contact their local congressman about issues. Those types of things have really helped us provide a wider swath of information and engage this whole layer of people who are really interested in providing information about their government and having an audience for that. So.
I was just going to say quickly, there are more and more efforts along those lines. There's more training to be done for citizen journalists and collaboration perhaps between mainstream media or whatever you want to call it these days and citizen journalists. And as you yourself said in your question more or less, it's easier and easier to get access and to get online and get your voice heard. But I still don't think, none of that probably is going to replace the need for there to be structure and funded organizations that can sort of maintain vigilance over time, that have staffs that are trained. I mean, I think there's room for everything, and one doesn't replace the other, but there's just a need to bring more people up to speed on their rights and what they can do, and using some of the resources that are available to get their voices heard.
Thank you.
One of my favorite lines from the Knight Commission's final report was that journalism in the United States didn't need saving so much as it needed creating. That even at the heyday of journalism, if you want to call it the heyday of mainstream newspaper journalism, there were huge numbers of communities in the United States that were receiving nothing like daily media attention, even though obviously the public affairs of those local communities, although small, were of great interest to their citizens. And it seems to me that the only way of getting the beat coverage and investigative reporting that these local communities need is going to be through increasing networks, a sort of pro-am networks that combine the kinds of institutions, you know, Mark was just talking about, with the efforts of people who are not doing it on a full-time professional basis. And by the way, I just want to say on the municipal website thing, yes, WordPress is cheap. It's not clear that they will carry as much video as the average municipality wants, but in any event, the website, although cheap, is not self-loading. And that's the problem, that even with WordPress, you're talking about, to do the job right, you know, the salary of one full-time employee. And, you know, it's the mission of every municipality. But that's, you know, the question is whether it's perceived as being central enough to actually get the money.
Please join me in thanking our panelists for both lucid and insightful presentations.